You've all seen a heist movie. There is a professional team with each person bringing their own specialised skill. They have high-tech equipment and they always have the right tools. The buildings and routes of entry are meticulously planned out and the getaways are clean. Well, this isn't going to be any of that at all. But through sheer luck, community and patriotism, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a success. This is the story of a very important artefact that belongs to the people of Scotland, which was stolen from us by the English a very long time ago. And even after hundreds of years, some Scottish students decided that they were going to steal it back. The Stone of Destiny. And a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the mad lad, it is in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid has taken gaming by storm and has brought a true console level experience to gaming on the move. With millions of champion combinations and countless tactics to master, you will conquer raids, dungeons, campaign battles and bosses, and my personal favourite mode, the PvP arena, to mine that precious soul. In addition, there are hundreds of artifacts and buffs with over 600 unique champions to choose from, so you can fight your battles the way you want. Use my link in the description box down below to download Raid for free on your phone or PC. Sylvania was betrayed by the elves of Aravia. Her family used to speak to the spirits on behalf of the Queen, but the elves had a sort of cultural renaissance and started getting rid of people that they didn't like. So she came home to find her family missing. After that, she decided to be alone and wouldn't share the magic anymore. Still, we need those potions, so you've got to learn how to defeat her. Sylvania is all about healing. She heals up to half her health every time she gets a turn, and she also deals bonus damage based on how much HP she has left. However, if you have one or two champions that can keep a healing reduction debuff on her, then you can win. The only problem is that she can put up a block debuffs buff, so be sure to bring someone who can remove enemy buffs. And this month, Raid has released a new Doom Tower update. There are two huge new bosses to beat, Astronix the Dark Fae and Bommel the Dreadhorn, along with new enemy balance on tower floors, new secret rooms to discover, and most importantly, new powerful artifact sets to be won. On top of that, this whole month is packed with awesome events and tournaments, including one very special event with a brand new feature, Super Raids. Super Raids lets you double up your rewards from hitting dungeons and massively speeds up your progress. This is amazing for new players, and if there's ever a time to start playing, it's now. So if you want a starting boost in Raid Shadow Legends, then hit the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and you will get 200,000 silver, an XP booster, an energy refill, an ancient shard and the epic champion Chonaru, so you can summon a great champion as soon as you get into the game. These rewards are only available to new players and only for the next 30 days, and you can find these rewards here in your inbox. The Stone of Destiny, also known as the Coronation Stone or the Stone of Scone, was used historically in the coronation of Scottish kings and queens in the High Middle Ages, at least up until the year of 1296, when it was stolen by the English under King Edward I as war spoils from the Scone Abbey during the invasion of Scotland, specifically after the Battle of Dunbar. The stone is surrounded by myths and legends, though some people have theorised that the Scone Abbey monks may have hidden the original stone and replaced it with a replica, which meant that the stone the English had stolen was a fake, though this has never been confirmed and is most likely untrue. But even if it was, The current stone has a strong history of its own. A legend involving the stone had some people calling it the Stone of Jacob, because supposedly the biblical figure Jacob had used the stone as a pillow as he dreamed of angels going up the ladder to heaven in the book of Genesis. Because of this story, people believed that the stone had been brought to Scotland by the prophet Jeremiah via Egypt, Spain, and then Ireland. This has since been debunked, however, because geologists have concluded that the stone was quarried in the vicinity of Scone, Scotland. In ancient times, there was also apparently a metal plaque attached to the stone, which read as follows: "Unless the fates be faulty grown, and prophet's voice be vain, wherever is found this sacred stone, the Scottish race shall reign." I fucking love it. Despite being a large block of sandstone, it is one of the oldest symbols of Scottish sovereignty, and it has cultural and historic significance to many, especially to Scottish nationalists, or at least the people who like to call themselves Scottish nationalists. One of those nationalists was a man named Ian Hamilton, a Paisley-born student of law from the University of Glasgow. He was concerned for the people of Scotland because in the 1950s the country was a completely different place to what it is now. For example, we had rights and stuff back then. But the problems that Ian was focusing on was rationing was still in full force even long after the war had ended, and housing shortages were a serious issue in many poverty-stricken areas across the land. And, of course, the Tories were in power. All of this had made the majority of people in Scotland feel extremely demoralised, and Ian wanted to do something about that. He knew that a stonemason and Scottish National Party councillor from Glasgow named Robert Gray had previously planned to steal the Stone of Destiny back from Westminster Abbey where it was being held, and then replace it with a replica that he had made back in 1929. And since Ian was desperate to strike a blow that would rekindle the nationalist flame in Scotland, he began researching how the stone could be stolen from Westminster Abbey. As a nationalist, he felt that it was his duty to return the stone rightfully to Scotland, and that it should not reside in the hands of the English thieves that took it, and that it was an absolute travesty that it had been stolen from them in the first place. So, he decided to take the stone back. After all, it's not stealing if it's already yours, is it? Ian travelled down to Westminster Abbey to scout the place, plan the journey, and find any weak points of entry. He also took out every book that he could find about the building from Glasgow's Mitchell Library. He recruited an engineering student named Gavin Vernon and a domestic science student named Kay Matheson, both of whom were members of the Glasgow University Nationalist Association, and later they were joined by another student named Alan Stewart. One of the founding members of the Nationalist Association and an SNP leader named John McCormick funded Ian to the sum of £50 to go and get the stone, and £50 was quite a wee chunk of money back then. Now that Ian had his team together and was confident with the research he had done, his plan went into motion, and a couple of days before Christmas Day in 1950, the four students made their way down to Westminster Abbey in two Ford Anglias. This was an arduous 18-hour journey because in the 1950s there were no snowplows or gritting on the road, so the roads were much more dangerous to travel. They also didn't have enough money for hotels, petrol or food, according to Ian, and they had to phone home to ask for more, likely by asking McCormick. However, they pushed through and finally arrived at Westminster Abbey. Near Christmas Eve, Ian was scouting the inside of the Abbey and was locked in. He was later caught and approached by a night watchman, and you would think that this would be extremely suspicious and the cops would be called right away, but the night watchman just assumed that Ian was a homeless man looking for somewhere to sleep. And the night watchman kindly showed him the way out of the west door and even offered him some money. Good person, shit security guard. This event did not deter Ian though, because later they returned to carry out what they had planned to do. Parking one car across from the Abbey in the Old Palace Yard, they approached the only pine wooden side door and began opening it, which involved using Heist movie level tools such as the crowbar. Ian later commented on this, saying, "You sort of know that when you take a crowbar to a side door of Westminster Abbey and jimmy the lock, that there isn't really any going back, don't you? Not when you know that the next thing that you're about to do is steal one of the ancient relics inside." After they managed to pry the door open, they made their way through the building to the coronation chair, which the stone was placed inside of. Ian recalled not being able to see a thing, saying it was desperately dark, so dark that you could cut the air and carry it away with you. Yet they continued on, using the light of a small torch. This heist had been meticulously planned, so much so that they very quickly managed to enter the building and reach the Stone of Destiny. There was just one tiny little thing that they did not consider. Something they kinda should have made a note of. You see, the Stone of Destiny is a big stone. A stone that weighed about 152 kilograms, which is the equivalent to 336 pounds. It turns out that big stones are very, very heavy. So they struggled to pull the big stone out of the coronation chair. But eventually they managed to get it out. They now had the Stone of Scone, the Stone of Destiny, the Stone of Scottish Kings, an ancient and powerful artefact that symbolised the pride of the great nation of Scotland. And they dropped it. They fucking dropped it, and it broke in half. They dropped the fucking Stone of Destiny, and it broke in half. One half actually landed on Kay's foot, breaking two of her toes. And this injury would go on to affect her for the rest of her life. They had to move quickly and couldn't stop for anything, not even Kay's pretty bad injury. Otherwise, they would be caught. So Ian got straight to carrying the smaller piece of the stone across the road to one of the getaway cars that Kay was driving and placed it in the boot. He then got into the passenger seat, and as he did, Kay noticed a policeman doing his rounds. So Ian and Kay immediately pretended that they were lovers and started kissing each other. Well played, Ian. The policeman didn't notice anything suspicious, but he stopped to speak to them. The three of them then proceeded to have a conversation, with Ian telling the officer that he and Kay had been unable to find a bed and breakfast for the night. And even though it was very early in the morning, around 5 o'clock, they somehow managed to stay completely calm. They had a cigarette with the police officer, and they continued sharing some banter. As the policeman was leaving, he wished them a cheery Merry Christmas, and Kay started her journey back into Westminster Abbey to retrieve the other half of the stone. Ian went to go and get the second car, which was parked a little further up from the Abbey, so that he could pick up the second piece of the stone. He took it upon himself to drag the larger piece of the stone to the car using his coat, eventually managing to load it into the boot. And just as he was about to drive away, he realised that he couldn't find his car keys. So Ian had to go back inside the Abbey to find his car keys in the pitch black, with only some matches to use as a light source. But, very luckily for him, while he was looking, he stood on his keys. It seemed that they had fallen out of the pocket of the coat that he used to drag the stone, because the genius didn't think to take them out of the pocket first. The crew then left the scene in their cars. Shortly after the team had made their getaway, a night watchman named Andrew Hislop was doing his early morning rounds when he noticed that there were scuff marks across the floor of Westminster Abbey. His torch led him to the coronation chair, where he saw that the stone was completely gone. The chair was also badly damaged, and apparently someone had also scratched the letters JFS into the chair, which is thought by some to mean Justice for Scotland. The night watchman immediately got on the phone and reported the theft to the local authorities, and the police immediately went into overdrive, firing into action by setting up roadblocks on every single road in and out of London, and also completely closing the borders of both Wales and Scotland, which is something that hadn't happened for over 400 years. And I love how as soon as the Stone of Destiny goes missing, they just knew it was one of us. The Stone of Destiny is missing. I smell Celtic shenanigans. Shut it down. Now, the gang were leaving London in their cars, with the larger part of the stone being in Ian's car. But the stone was so heavy that the suspension on Ian's car was way down. It was pretty clear that something very heavy was inside. And the cops were all looking for people who had stolen something very heavy. Something very important to Scottish people. So, a bunch of Scottish people in a car that was clearly carrying something very heavy would probably have raised some suspicions with the police. So Gavin, fearing that this would get them caught, bailed on the heist, and he made his way to Rugby in Warwickshire by train, where he got another train back to Scotland. Given how there were roadblocks and checkpoints everywhere and the borders were closed, the crew knew that it would be too dangerous to take the stone straight back to Scotland, because if they got pulled over by the police, it was all over. So they decided to hide the stones and wait for the heat to die down and then collect them at a later date. Ian and Alan made their way up to Kent to hide the larger piece of the stone by burying it in a field. After they had buried it, they started the long drive back to Scotland. Kay had left her car containing the smaller piece of the stone with her friend in the Midlands, and, like Gavin, finished her journey to Scotland by train. It wasn't smooth sailing though, because she had to endure some train searches and roadblocks on the way home, but she got through all of them because nobody suspected a lone woman of stealing the Stone of Destiny. After the news of the missing stone had spread, headlines about it were made the world over, and in Scotland the reaction at the thought that the Stone of Destiny might be back in its homeland had boosted everyone's mood. It had brought up morale for everyone except for the Unionists, who thought that it was a complete disgrace that someone had caused so much unrest. The search by the police was difficult but comical. They searched absolutely everywhere, listening to any tip-off that they were given, including searching the 40-acre Serpentine Lake in London after someone had spread a rumour that the stone had been dumped into it, and also checking hotels and boarding houses around the border between England and Scotland. Just a fortnight later, Ian and some of his friends went back to England to recover both pieces of the stone. There was just one tiny little problem. The field where they had buried the larger piece of the stone, well, while they were gone, it had become a gypsy camp. And as if by some gypsy magic, they had built their camp exactly on top of where the stone was buried. So Ian had to sweet talk them. And Ian actually managed to achieve the impossible. He got the gypsies to move. The gypsies moved that part of their camp and allowed Ian and his crew to dig up the stone. They stayed and camped for a few days, and after they all grouped back up, they finally got both pieces of the stone across the Scottish border, taking it straight to Glasgow. And here they took it to Robert Gray to mend the stone, and while he was repairing it, Robert had placed a brass rod inside the stone containing a piece of paper, and to this day, nobody knows what is written on it. After a tip-off, the police visited Kay's parents' home by Firemore Beach, Inverisdale, near Lochhew, and demanded that Kay tell them where the stone was. She lied and told them that it was in a nearby peat bog, later laughing that she had gotten the police to cut all of her peat for the whole year. Ian and the three others evaded capture for some weeks, keeping their heads down and going about their normal daily routines. The net, however, had closed in on them, and eventually all four of them were brought in for questioning. Apparently, the police were so desperate that they had started to ask around at libraries in Scotland to see if anyone had taken out books pertaining to Westminster Abbey and the stone. And since Ian and the other students had been taking out many of these books for research at Glasgow's Mitchell Library, their names showed up in the library records. The police were onto them. Or were they? The police brought all of them in for questioning, but the group were smart enough to pull the no comment routine, meaning the police had absolutely nothing to charge them with, so they had to let them go. They had been right there in front of the police, but since the police were useless in their investigation and the students said nothing, they could not get them to incriminate themselves. After the police interviews, the students returned back to their university studies, but now they all knew that they were under extremely heavy suspicion. They begrudgingly had to work out how to give the stone back before the police had enough time to collect any more solid evidence against them and issue a warrant for their arrest. Enough time had passed that the people of Scotland were actually starting to think that the stone was gone forever, which demoralised them, which was the opposite of what Ian and his crew wanted, as it would dim the nationalist spirit. Ian and the three students were never taken to trial, not just because of their silence, but because the prosecuting authorities had decided that it was not in the public interest to take them to court. This was most likely because they knew the case would make for embarrassing headlines and also stoke the flames of Scottish nationalists who would undoubtedly rally behind their cause. The nationalist cause at the time was already a big thorn in the government's side because John McCormick had announced the new National Covenant, which was a petition to the United Kingdom Parliament for Scotland to have home rule over its own laws. 2 million Scots had signed it, demanding to have their own parliament, and there is no doubt that the return of the Stone of Destiny had helped in making nationalism a big topic of discussion again. After devising a way to return the stone, Ian and the rest of the group called on 2 councillors from Arbroath named D.A. Gardner and F.W.A. Thornton. After speaking to them, Ian, Gavin and Alan arranged to meet them at the ruins of the Arbroath Abbey on the 11th of April 1951. The 2 councillors stood at the entrance to the Abbey waiting for the students to arrive, and later, when the 3 of them appeared, the councillors moved forward to help them carry the heavy stone. They then carried it up the nave of the ruined abbey between the ruins of the pillars. There, they placed the Stone of Destiny on the floor where the high altar once stood, and they draped a Scottish flag over the stone. The high altar was where the Declaration of Arbroath, also known as the Scottish Declaration of Independence, had been signed in 1320. The crew then got out of there quick, and then the two councillors contacted the police with the location of the stone. The point of having the police find the stone at this very sacred place in Scottish history was done just as a final fuck you to the English. Meanwhile, the custodian of the abbey, a man named James Wishart, immediately locked the gates and stood guard over the stone until the authorities arrived. The stone was quickly removed and secured in the Forfar Police headquarters, where it was locked in a cell. Later, when Wishart, Gardner and Thornton were questioned as to the identities of the men bringing the stone into the abbey, they all testified that the men were reverent and bowed their heads. So, conveniently, they could not describe the men's faces or appearance at all. Wishart only said that they were all young, well-set-up lads, and the car they were driving was described as being big and dark-coloured. And also, none of them had taken a note of the registration number, so you know that really narrows it down. It's blatantly obvious what had happened. These men were secretly supporters of what Ian and the others had done, and I am sure they were very happy to see the stone back on its home soil, even if it was only for a second. Wishart had later said that he always told visitors to the abbey that one day the Stone of Destiny would come back to this historic spot, and that he was glad to see that his words had come true. After 3.5 months, the stone was brought back to England, and in 1953 it was used in the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Since then it has not been used, and it remained in Westminster Abbey without any major events up until 1996, where the stone was moved and now sits in Edinburgh. However, it is essentially there on loan, as it is still considered property of the Crown. This was likely enough of a compromise for some people in Scotland, but not among the more hardcore nationalists. There is still speculation, however, that when the stone was taken to Glasgow, Robert Gray had made several copies of it, and the one that was returned to Westminster Abbey was a fake, while the real one remains hidden in Scotland somewhere, with its location known only to a few people. But if this story were true, then the people who know of the stone's true location have most likely passed away. Kay Matheson later became a much respected teacher of home economics and Gaelic, and unsuccessfully stood for the SNP against the young Charles Kennedy in what was the parliamentary seat of Ross, Cromarty and Skye in 1983. Despite facing off against each other, the two became very good friends. Kay Matheson later died in 2013 at the age of 84, having had her 2 broken toes finally amputated only some years before. Gavin Vernon emigrated to Canada and had a quiet life pursuing a career in engineering. At one point he recalled that after everything he had done, he never had to pay for a beer again while in Scotland. He later died in his adopted homeland in 2004 at the age of 77 after being diagnosed with cancer. He is survived by his wife Anne and their son. Alan Stewart was the most quiet of the group, and he never really spoke of his role in the event. He died on the 12th of March 2019, But before he did, he still had a positive attitude, and as he was being anaesthetised before high-risk surgery, he was asked how he felt, and he replied that he would feel a lot better if Scotland beat England in the football that coming Saturday. Ian Hamilton later described his group's capture of the Stone of Destiny as a liberation, not a theft. And he looks back on the entire event as a symbolic show of national pride. Earlier in 2008, a film had been made of their exploits called The Stone of Destiny, and Ian even made a cameo in the movie. He said that he was proud to do something for his country that didn't spill a single drop of blood. You know, just a couple of broken toes. He went on to have a distinguished career as one of the Queen's Counsel. And he is now the last remaining member of the group at the age of 95. And he is now living in retirement. So overall, the heist wasn't exactly the most elegant, but it was successful in returning the Stone of Destiny to its rightful place. Even if it was only for a little while.
The Home Secretary made a statement to the House of Commons. It was known who had done it. It would not be in the public interest to prosecute the vulgar vandals. That's been a phrase that I've always enjoyed all my life.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody subscribe!